The mess is real. I've been getting some pieces ready for an art show at the Silk Weaving Studio in Granville Island, and this is a really big deal for me because this place was such a big inspiration to me back in the day when I was a new weaver, and I never dreamed that something that I had made would ever be exhibited there. And I had this idea to create a series of pieces that contrasted a fairly regular pattern with a more organic figure in the foreground. And today I wanted to work with this beautiful hand-woven satin silk ikat fabric. It's one of the fabric scraps that I brought back from my trip to Uzbekistan, and it really reminded me of these flowers that I saw in the market. And I'm going to see if I can recreate the spirit of those flowers on my little figure here. I'd actually been planning to share this video with you when I was showing how to do the ruching technique in my last video, but things just didn't quite work out. Let me tell you about what happened. So I started out well. As I said, I'm doing the ruching technique where I'm taking this piece of silk fabric and I'm going to scrumple it up and stitch it down onto the background. Now you might notice that hexagon that's sitting off to the side there. That was my first prototype, and I learned a few things from that. And when I was making that piece, I sewed the figure directly onto the background cloth, and you might notice that there's a bit of puckering happening there. And I was really hoping that the figures would lie flat against the backgrounds. And I know that this ruching technique really can make your fabric gather up. So I've chosen to stitch my figure separately and then attach it to the background. This fabric, though really luscious and reflective and beautiful, is not the easiest to work with. As you can see, it's fraying quite a bit, and that was not what I had in mind. So I started to think about how am I going to deal with that. So I thought, well, maybe I can cover it up with the next little bit of fabric. So I folded that over and I started to sew that down. But things were really looking quite chaotic. And if you've been watching my videos, you know that I like a little bit of chaos. But this was more than I could manage. And I kept persisting in trying to get it to work out and do what I had in my head. And the piece just had a mind of its own. When I'm just making things to amuse myself, I don't usually worry too much about whether they're air quotes good or not, but because I was making this for show, this is where my personal inner critic crept in. I tried all sorts of things to try to tame the fabric, but it was just not working the way that I thought it should. And then, of course, my thoughts started to go to my stuff isn't good enough. I'm not good enough. I was really getting quite frustrated and not having fun anymore. And I had to remind myself if I'm not having fun, what is the point? So eventually, I had to just set this piece aside and work on something else. And then after working on something else for a while, I was able to come back to this piece and actually finish it. And, maybe it's not the best thing I've ever made, but it's certainly good enough. And in the end, I was actually really happy with how my pieces turned out. Now, I didn't get as many of these pieces made as I was hoping, and I had to rethink what I wanted to submit to the show. And you might remember these quilt as you go hexagons from one of my other videos, and I think I mentioned that one day I might actually sew them together. Well, I decided that this was the time for them to be sewn together. And then I have these other two pieces, which were reflections on a couple of short trips that I took last year, and that was it for my submissions to the show. I hear that they've had really good feedback from people who've come to see it, and perhaps I didn't really need to worry about that inner voice in my head. And here's a sign that I noticed while I was on the island. And here are some of the other pieces that were in the show. Mallory has such an interesting approach to cross stitch, and Bettina does these beautiful chain stitch landscapes. And Anne's display was really compelling, contrasting the types of messages that the young women often receive with what perhaps they'd rather be doing. And in the end, despite my inner critic, I was quite pleased with the pieces that I was able to include in the show. I hope you've enjoyed this video and thanks a lot for watching and see you again soon. Bye for now.